Curiosity creates clarity. I went with this title because when we are managing these complex agro ecosystems, these landscapes, there's so many moving factors. There's so many different parts and between the land, the soil, wildlife dynamics, people, finances. There's so much complexity. And so what I've found in my travels and my journeys is the people who have the most curiosity to dig a little bit deeper and find out really what's going on. Those are the people that have the clarity and are making the biggest leaps as far as regenerative agriculture goes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on who I am, how I've come along in my journey, and then we're going to talk about a case study that's fairly prominent from the Cottonwood Ranch in Northeast Nevada. And we're lucky to have A.G. Smith here with us as well. He and I can kind of bounce off of each other as we go through that. So my roots, I'm from Southern Alberta. Grew up on a sort of a mixed farm near the Montana border. And my family, like I said, it was a mixed farm, conventional cropping. I always loved growing up on the farm, so much freedom, so much room to explore. I was never drawn to the cropping side of things. Something about it just didn't connect with me. And I had our farm was situated, as you can see here, where the blue pin is, and it was at the base of a vast expanse of native grasslands that stretched to the west, basically all the way to the Rocky Mountains, where Glacier Park sits in Montana. And this photo here, I was maybe about 8 or 9 years old, and this was one of these days that transformed my life forever. Where my mom, she would take us up onto this big expanse of grassland, and you get up there and crest this valley overlooking the Milk River. You can see the Rocky Mountains in the distance, and it was a feeling that I've never experienced before. It was a feeling of connection with something that I couldn't really explain as a 9-year-old, of course, but you look out and you could see 50 miles out into the distance without a single human structure, maybe just a fence. You've got pronghorn antelope, you've got elk roaming, mule deer. And this moment sort of stuck with me as my years went on. My family sold the farm when I was about 12 years old. We moved away, and that really devastated me. But there was something just tugging at me the whole time I moved through my teenage years. I was pulled back to the land in my early 20s. So I'm 34 now, for some context. My early 20s, I decided, man, there's something about getting back on the land and working on a ranch that I just couldn't resist. And so I went to work for this pretty big outfit right on the Alberta Montana border. These are the Sweetgrass Hills here in the distance, which are right on the border. And I really went to work cutting my teeth, getting back into ranching and agriculture. And through that process, I knew I discovered something. I mean, this was just it, I knew I was born to do this type of work and especially grazing animals and through this process of working with these large herds of cattle and really getting to know how to manage them on a big scale, I was drawn to bison. I was drawn to the animal themselves and why do they not exist anymore on a large scale? Like I knew they weren't extinct, that you see them around here and there. They're in parks. Some people have them on farms and ranches, but I kept following this curiosity of, why don't we have more? And nobody really had a satisfactory answer for me. So I kept following that and found a position on a ranch here in Southern Alberta that I was really able to gain this experience working with bison in a really unique setting on a fairly large scale on about 12,000 acres and a few hundred head of bison. And from that, I was able to start a meat business and, really just continue to dive deeper and deeper. And in that process, I knew as somebody getting back into agriculture, I would maybe be fourth generation, but essentially I'm starting over. So how do I go about this? I mean, I need to I need to figure some things out here and think outside the box to make this work. So I very quickly in 2015 discovered holistic management, and that really opened up a whole new world for me. And so holistic management made a huge impact on me, and I continue to follow that down deeper and deeper and immerse myself, taking courses from people like Roland Cruz and Kirk Gadzia and some of these experienced educators in holistic management. And through that journey, I went through the process of being fixated on these animals as these amazing creatures that they are. But then along the line, our perspective shifts, and I realized, oh, okay, well, it's actually about the grass. And kept following that a little bit further until one day I went to a workshop in June of 2017 by this woman, Nicole Masters from New Zealand. And I walked into this room, I was thinking I knew something about managing land and managing grass and that type of thing. And this woman is standing at the front of this room in a room full of cowboys and cowgirls with the most confidence I've ever seen in my life and starts talking about how soil is truly alive. And that moment, it was like a punch in the gut because before that, I didn't really fully grasp that soil was a living, breathing organism. I knew that, yeah, there's earthworms, there's some bugs crawling around in the soil, but that moment really struck me so hard. And for anybody who's been to a Nicole Masters workshop, she's famous for having soil pits where you go out and you dig a big pit and you look at all the different layers of the soil. And so we did that. We went out in the field and did the whole soil pit thing, and it completely blew my mind. And it was a 2-day workshop. That was just the first day. And I'm embarrassed to say it now, but that second day, I was so overwhelmed with what I learned that first day that I just left. I went up into the mountains and camped by myself to try to process what it was that I just learned. So those were some life-changing moments for me on my journey. And so during that time, my wife and I, we had the chance to go and move to Texas to manage a bison ranch down there. And that was an excellent experience to learn how to manage in a different ecosystem, a totally different climate, much hotter than we're used to up here in the Northern Plains. And we had Nicole come and consult with us during that time, and she did a workshop, and we really got to know her then. And she kept talking about this program she was developing about essentially a master's degree in regenerative ag or agroecology. And I said, hey, when you get this sorted out, let me know. I'm in. And so a couple of years later, 2021, we had just moved back to Alberta, and Nicole calls me up and said, hey, we've got this Create program started. Do you want to join? And I believe I was the first one to sign up. I said, I am completely in. This is what I know I want to do with my life. So I joined the first cohort of the Create program, which stands for Consciously Regenerating Ecosystems in Agriculture Through Transformative Experiences. Really, there's no program like it in the world. It's really developed for people who are serious about becoming a professional in regenerative ag in some way. We have people who are primary producers, people who are more on the consulting agronomy side, and sort of anyone in between. We've got a diverse group of people who have taken the course all the way from turf management, cropping, vineyards, small scale gardening to large scale rangeland. And so I think the diversity of the people who we have in our cohort is what makes it special. We've done 3 Create programs. And so after I graduated from the first one, Nicole asked me to join her team as a coach or a teacher on the subsequent Create programs. The second Create, we hosted the first week of that at Cottonwood Ranch, which is where I got to know AG. And we are currently in the middle of our third Create program, based out of the UK, working with students from all across Europe. We have a student in Africa and Australia, and so it's quite widespread. and very interesting. And so our network in Integrity Soils, we take a global perspective of land regeneration. Of course, Nicole comes from New Zealand, and now lives in Montana. So we're fairly North American centric, but like I said, we're working in the UK and in Europe and Africa and a lot of different places, which really has opened my eyes as to how people do agriculture across the world, how different it can be, but how similar it is and how the principles apply no matter where you are. So what do I do as a regenerative coach? Sort of grazing consulting. Rangelands are my passion and sort of, I guess, my specialty. So we do soil monitoring, we do baseline monitoring to identify, where are we at in our soils and really start to build this picture around where do we want to go, where do we want to take these landscapes, and how we can, start to manage for more resilient, profitable ecosystems. I'm also really into the land design and the infrastructure piece, specifically around grazing. And with my bison background, I love to work with new and existing bison producers. Nicole and I just recently released a grazing course, an online grazing course, focused on how to graze for microbiology. And we really built the course that I wish I had back in 2017 when I was totally overwhelmed with, learning that soil is alive. And so we just came out with this in December. It's fully online. You work at it at your own pace. And so if you go to integritysoils.com, you can find the Grazing for Life course and use the discount code AGSteward20 for 20% off of that. Some other landscapes that we are working on, some different properties. This is the Durham Bison Ranch in Wyoming, south of Gillette, Wyoming. I work alongside my associate here, Roland Cruz, who I was a former holistic management student of, and he's brought me in. Roland has been working with these guys for over 30 years, working on holistic management and improving management and range monitoring. They've seen some major successes over that time, increasing plant cover, reducing bare ground, increasing production, and some of those things. But they are looking to go beyond that and start to look at their soil and see, really what might be happening underground that could be influencing, maybe a plateau in management. And so it's been really cool to work with John Flokini and these guys at the Durham Ranch. Big place, 55,000 acres, 25 head of bison, 90 paddocks. Quite impressive to see this herd move through that ranch. Another place we were on this summer, the Laurel Leaf Ranch, also Brock Livestock Company out of Casey, Wyoming. They're along the North Fork of the Powder River. Another fairly big place. They sold their cows a few years ago and started moving towards large mobs of yearlings that they put together and graze seasonally, daily, multiple times a day moves at pretty high stock densities, and they are seeing some rapid change on their land, especially some of this flood irrigated ground along the Powder River. So keep an eye out for these guys. I'm sure they'll be hosting workshops and they really want to, share what they're doing and get the word out there. This is an interesting one. We hosted the first week of Create at the Althorpe Estate in Northampton, UK, and this is owned by the Spencer family, who I claim that I'm related to, but I don't think they bid on that one. But this is Princess Diana's brother Charles, who owns this estate, and they got onto Nicole's work through her book For the Love of Soil, and really realized that across this 14,000 acres, which some of it's managed themselves and some they lease out to tenant farmers, that they really were going down a bad path with all the conventional tillage and chemical treadmill that they're on. And so they're looking to transition the whole estate to regenerative agriculture in the next couple of years. So pretty cool to see what they're doing. The UK, I mean, so much opportunity in agriculture over there. Mainly to do with their climate. I was talking to AG on the phone yesterday and said, if they don't get rain for about 3 weeks, they're in sort of a major drought crisis. And so, it rains consistently throughout the year. And as you can see, they're able to grow some grass. And of course, here, Southwest Alberta, we're along the Rocky Mountains, just north of Glacier Park. Do a lot of work here with grasslands, farms, and ranches. And over on the right, you can see this innovative uh, carbon farming system called bioactive emissions farming that I am following and involved in, where you take the exhaust from the tractor and cool it through this fusion tank in the center, and it creates this carbon microbial brew. These two side tanks inoculate that carbon with biology, and that is forced back out through the seed drill, through this can be set up on a sprayer, really anything, and it is vaped onto the soil. It's remarkable the results of this. This is now 20 some years in the making, in the sixth generation. Conventional farms are able to go cold turkey off of fertilizers and with no reduction in yield, increased plant health, and increases of soil organic matter on average of 0.5% per year. So pretty incredible stuff. So the way we operate is with a collaborative mindset. We are not the experts. I am not an expert. We do not have all the answers, and nobody has all the answers, but we strive to ask the right questions. So really digging deep and again, getting curious as to what's going on the land and curious as to what it is we truly want and how do we want our life and our land to look and move in that direction. And so back to this piece about curiosity creates clarity. And AG is a perfect example of that. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more here. So a framework that we use, Nicole developed called the 5Ms, the 5Ms framework. And essentially, mindset encapsulates everything that we're doing and we're managing on the land. And so mindset encapsulates, of course, our management decisions and how those management decisions influence organic matter, carbon, minerals, and microbes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a case study from Cottonwood Ranch, Northeast Nevada, of, I suppose, what's becoming a fairly famous case study of how they were able to take some very degraded land and sort of transform it through curiosity. So you can see AG here. This is when he took us to the top of the Jarbidge Mountains. He's pointing off in the distance, probably talking about an elk hunt he was on 30 years ago or something like that. And on the right, you can see the north side, what we call the north side of the Cottonwood Creek at the headquarters, where they've been doing holistic management intensive grazing for about 30 years or so. So we're looking at the Cottonwood Ranch, and you can see here on the left-hand side from 2016, the south side, everything that's pretty brown to the south of the creek is what we call the south side, and I believe it's about 250 acres. And then so on the north side, it's a much smaller portion that they were managing pretty intensively, and the soil health couldn't be more different between those two sites. What you see on the right is the south side in 2023, after they've got pivots installed and moved away from the flood irrigation and have went through a few years of this sort of soil health program that we're going to talk about. So pretty cool to see the contrast between the two. So when looking through the lens of the 5Ms, we start with mindset, and talking with AG, it's interesting. Over the years, they had this sort of mindset with people coming in and trying to figure out what was going on with that land being so compacted and so degraded, not really producing anything. And sort of the conclusion that a lot of people came to was, well, this is just the way it is. It might be the soil type, it might be whatever. Maybe this is all it can produce. And that sort of manifested into, well, it would have been continuously hayed for a very long time. The flood irrigation was problematic as far as being able to manage the water and have water on it at the right time. But essentially, when there was water coming down Cottonwood Creek, it would saturate that field and, it would grow a little bit. But as soon as the water left, there was zero growth and it dried up and basically things got cooked off. And so it sort of over the years manifested into, well, maybe sacrifice area is a little bit harsh, AG, but continuous haying and horse grazing over the years. And nobody had thought to dig a hole and during that time. And so finally, as AG is a curious person, he kept trying to get to the bottom of this, and he met Nicole, maybe 6 years ago or something, and said, "Hey, would you mind coming out and trying to help us figure out what's going on here?" And so, being the humble guy that he is, he was able to ask for help, which is sometimes all we need to do to get things moving. So, looking at the organic matter on that field, you'll see pictures of it coming up here. The organic matter, carbon and organic matter is one of the most important metrics that we look at on a landscape. If we are deficient in carbon and organic matter, then our soil is likely to be totally dysfunctional and not resilient and not able to produce much. We've lost a lot of organic matter, especially on agricultural land that's been tilled and farmed for a long time or overgrazed for a long time, which is a lot of our agricultural land across the world. On this field on the south side, the organic matter wasn't horrible. It was a little less than 3%, but it was existing in this non-functional thatch layer that essentially wouldn't allow water to actually penetrate it, and it wasn't available for plants and microbes to use. It had a lack of humus, so it had some organic matter, but humus, which is the more stable form of carbon and organic matter, which, contrary to popular belief or some narratives out there, a lot of people believe that organic matter is the result of sort of, plant material being trampled back in or incorporated back into the soil. But most of our stable organic matter is built up through plant photosynthesis, pumping sugars into the soil, having microbes consume those sugars, and then dying and turning over and being eaten by others in the soil food web and pooped out. And increasingly, you get this buildup of microbial necromass, dead microbes that form stable humus. So I'm missing some text here, but this is the north side of Cottonwood, where they had been grazing intensively, management-intensive grazing for about 30 years. Carbon is much higher. I was looking at some soil tests that you sent me, and I believe that the most recent test showed that this is about 8.7% organic matter. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, the what they did last fall. Yeah.
Okay.
That's sort of.
And so that checks out. It's a deep, dark, rich color all the way down through the soil profile. And another piece about this is there was 7 times the humus in these samples, which humus has about 10x water holding capacity to just like non-humic forms of organic matter. And so the water holding capacity of these pastures were about 700 times of the south side. Oh, so here's so 1 minute, in 1 minute, it took in 2 inches of water, nearly 95% plus palatable grass species. And so this is 70 times more water holding capacity than the south side. So here's the south side, and the south side is really interesting. You could see this thatch layer that sits on top. Most of the species up here are wiregrass. There's some sedges that were pretty unpalatable, and AG said there was a species of bluegrass that was in there that was sort of palatable, but over time that kind of got grazed out. before Nicole, they had never dug a hole on this, and so when they got out there, AG loves to use his backhoe, so he got his backhoe out there and started digging, and about 3 feet down, well, you can see where the roots end, about 3, 4 inches down, and this layer, I mean, there's some roots in there, but not much of more or less subsoil, and then basically, I don't want to call it a river, but there was a whole bunch of water sitting about 3 feet down below that soil surface that those plants were unable to access. This came as quite a surprise to these guys. You can see these cow pies sitting on top of the soil, not cycling in. Biology is just not functioning. And I just want to go back. Yeah, it took 24 minutes for 1 inch of water to infiltrate, which, I mean, after say 12 minutes, you know your water cycle is pretty broken. So through the 5 M's, we look at minerals, and when we look at rangeland, we work a lot on rangeland. Addressing mineral deficiencies is sometimes really difficult and completely uneconomical. But if you're working with some more higher production ground, irrigated ground, then you have a lot more leverage. So in the case of the south side, there was a major calcium deficiency. I don't quite have the numbers, but it was very low. Calcium's one of the most important, potentially more important than nitrogen, in terms of foundation for a soil health program. So over time, what seems to have happened is the calcium had been leached out because of all that flood irrigation and just lack of structure and lack of function. And so when we have calcium in the right balance, we have good soil structure. So we're able to build soil aggregates, which a part of that is mycorrhizal fungi development. Fungi need calcium to be able to develop and build those aggregates, which are pores that hold on to water and nutrients and allow roots to move through the profile. Calcium is critical to plant cell division and wall development. So think them being able to grow and maintain a strong, rugged structure. And I mean, I could keep going on and on about the importance of calcium, but it was pretty dire in that situation. Microbially speaking, the cell side was very low in active bacteria and fungi, very low in fungi. And we look at the total fungal to bacteria ratio. It was about 0.57 to 1. And this will really depend on the lab that you're using, what will spit out as a total fungal to bacteria ratio. So if you're doing soil testing, make sure you try to get an understanding from the lab that you choose to use and how they come up with that fungal to bacteria ratio, because it can be quite skewed. I know in PLFA tests, to have a 0.5 to 1 fungal to bacteria ratio is actually pretty good. So there's a lot of different approaches to this, but what they found on the north side, which is not really surprising, is 10 times the active fungi, 3 times total, more bacteria, which bacteria are essential. They're good for our system, but if they're out of balance, it's a problem. And so what they're seeing was this 1.75 to 1, so more fungi to bacterial biomass. And the more, generally speaking, there might be a certain point where this is a point of diminishing return, but generally, the more we can push our fungal to bacteria ratio up, the better it is for our pasture growth. And so as we look up the soil food web, we're looking at protists. So we're looking at protozoa, nematodes, and these are our larger predators in the soil food web. So these guys basically swim through the soil profile, eating bacteria. So as they're eating the bacteria, they're pooping them out the other side and create this pool of plant available nitrogen. So you see this end potential here in relation to how active those soil predators are. Much higher, of course, in the north side. We also look at the root feeding nematodes, so that, higher sort of parasitic nematodes in the south side versus the north side. An important piece to look at with the protists is that they need a water film in the soil to be able to swim around and hunt and graze on bacteria. So if our soil is drought stricken, it's not resilient, we don't have structure, we don't have water holding capacity, then we have a diminished ability for these protists to do their work and provide nitrogen to the plant. Plant health was, of course, lower as well. Outside of the palatability of the species, the palatability of the plants was much lower. Protein was much lower. All the nutrients across the board were quite a bit lower on that south side. And so what did they do? AG can help speak to this, but essentially starting in 2018, I believe, they started to trial this soil health program with vermicast, fish hydrolysate, molasses, humic acid. Didn't really work. It didn't really work because there were, all sorts of issues with water and drought and other things going on. And AG, do I have it right where you went about this program prior to ripping?
Yeah, prior to ripping, but also prior to having control of the water before the pivots. So it was still flood irrigated. So, and really, yeah, it was prior to all of that. So it was, and I'm not sure there was totally a loss, but we learned a lot. It was really a learning experience for a beginning start.
And so in 2019, they took a ripper through and ripped that ground because, there's a certain point on in some situations where, we don't generally like to look at tillage or some sort of major disturbance, but that ground needed a bit of a reset. And so they came through and they ripped it with it was an implement with shanks. Is that correct, AG?
Yeah, it was just, it had big
And
shanks.
why don't you describe how that went through there and what came up as a result?
Okay, so there was a couple early on when I was out aerating this ground. We were trying all sorts of things to see if we could improve the production on it. And when I'd get to the end of my row or my swath that I was going down, and I'd turn that tractor, and it was one of those big whatever aerators, and it when I turn, the whole 4 inches or so of that thatch just rotated. It just moved like a rug on a hardwood floor. And when that happened, I'm going, wow, this certainly shouldn't be, I don't think, doing this. So, but that 4 inches of thatch was so thick and such a barrier to put there's no way we tried to seed into it and through the years, and anyway, there's just nothing would take. So we figured we had to rip that thatch. We had to rip that up. So it was we hired it done. He brought this big tractor out, and he had all these tongs on the back, this ripper, and he dropped, it was a big tractor, and he dropped it into the ground thinking that this is the normal rate that he ran it, and it killed the tractor. He said he'd never ripped soil that was that tough. It was just incredibly compacted. And so when they finally got done, they ripped it in a couple of directions. You ended up with like bricks. There was like these 4 by 6 in different sizes, but they were like bricks. And it was just the whole field was just a mangle of these, and you'd break your ankle walking out across it. And we were going, how in the hell are we going to, and we couldn't really break it up any further than that unless we'd have taken a disc and dissed it and dissed it and dissed it. And we just didn't want to, or couldn't really afford to do all of that. So we were wondering how it was going to work to seed it. And the guys that we hired, they had access to this big Belgian cedar. It was made in Belgium, and this thing came out and it was huge. It was like when they unloaded it, it was all in sort of a knot thing to haul, and then they started pushing buttons or levers, and this thing just started opening up like a butterfly or whatever. And they said this cedar will work. We'll do that. It had a big roller on it that sort of rolled the soil and made a bed for it, and then it seeded it, and then it had rollers behind it. And by golly, it worked. It worked. Anyway.
And so that same year, I believe you were able to get the pivots installed.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we actually had installed, the pivots were being installed that same year. Yes, we ripped it and we installed the pivots in the same year, and then we came in with it was an NRCS program, so they wanted us to do some perennial plants. So we did some perennial grasses, but we also did cover crops with it. And that year we did radishes and oats, and there was one other one anyway. And so they came up good. It really seeded well, and things really popped up. And those radishes by the time they were done, there was lots of them were the size of a football in that soil. I didn't know radishes did that, but anyway, so and that itself helped, and they were specifically to help break soil up the way they grow. And so they did their thing, and then added organic, then brought it into the ground and added organics. So so anyway, that was the beginning. Everything came up really well, but the soil was still, still missing all those things. We put calcium on it, and we were trying to put as many inputs on it that we could afford. And but those they all jumped up a little bit. Those radishes did the best of all of them, but they all jumped up and grew for a little while, and then they didn't grow anymore. And a lot of weeds, not noxious weeds, but weeds came into it. And so the first 2 years, that sort of was that was the MO. It would, because the soil still was so poor, that the seeding would be good, but it wouldn't really produce much. And when we put cows on it and we grazed it, but it didn't hold them for very long. And then the third year into it, things really started changing. We'd been putting calcium on it. We've been putting an encapsulated slow nitrogen, that not just typical nitrogen you put on, but this was stuff that Nicole recommended, and some other things that the soil needed. And third year in, all of a sudden we went and we added, the part of that cover crop on the third year was triticale, and I think collard greens, and anyway, I had a variety of things. But production really, all of a sudden, it started the third year, and it went from, typically that south side would put up 3/4 of a ton to the acre back when we were haying it. We quit haying it quite a few years ago, just because it just wasn't really worth running the equipment over. And so we were grazing it, and we had quite a bit of wiregrass in it. And when we'd hay it, it was probably 25% wiregrass. But one of the things that happened after we started grazing it more is the animals would graze the good grasses and just leave the wiregrass. And so through probably 10 years, the wiregrass went from 25% of that side to 75%. The wiregrass was just expanding exponentially. And so it was getting to be less and less valuable for grazing even. So, and again, that's back to where we had lots of people said, well, maybe this just is what it's going to be. But when that third year we went from that 3/4 of a ton to the acre historically to about 1.5 tons to the acre off those 2 pivots. And then this last year, we're still putting more calcium and more inputs and things on it. And it's still not where we want it to be yet. But this last year, one of the pivots produced 1 3/4 ton to the acre, and the other pivot was 3 tons to the acre. We've never put up 3 tons to the acre in anything out here. And so,
I think AG, the photo I took here was of the 2022 crop, the first, real bumper that you had there. This is the west side at the, 3.5 tons per acre.
Yeah, it's been amazing. I mean, I wouldn't have thought we could take that soil and do what's happening to it. And it's just getting started. I mean, it's amazing. And we went from when we've been doing monitoring on that site for quite a while, because we're in a credit system for sage grouse. And so we have these permanent sites on the private that we monitor. And prior to Nicole and working with her, we had basically 3 grasses there. There was the wiregrass, then there was a little sedge, and then a bluegrass or something that was pretty palatable. They really liked the little sedge and the bluegrass for grazing and left the wiregrass. But this last year when we did it, there was 5 different, when we did this monitoring, there's 5 different perennial grasses in there now, and 6 different legumes that and it's all been seeded and planted in there, but they've taken, and I mean, it's just amazing, the variety. Before there was no wildlife. I mean, when we flood irrigated it, you'd get a lot of water birds and things because the water was just sitting on that ground. And if those grasses weren't just sitting in water, they wouldn't grow. And I've got pictures of the water of that side, grass sitting in the water sitting on the grass, and the grass growing right beside it. The grass is not sitting in water, and it's not growing. It just absolutely stopped and drying up. It was so dysfunctional that the sponge effect didn't. I mean, there was no sponge effect or anything to, and through the years, it's interesting. So lack of water control and flood irrigating over 100 some years leached the soil out and caused the problem. But if you took the water, but now we have created plants that absolutely require it. The only place they got their nutrients is with the water that was on there. And if you didn't put water on it, you got no production whatsoever. And so it was sort of a catch-22. We knew we needed to get control of the water. The minute we tried to control the water, the grass quit growing. So it was anyway. So it was a catch-22. But and from a wildlife perspective, some antelope would come on the edge and drink out of the irrigation ditches. But this last year, there was 2 antelope that raised their little ones on the pivot. They had them and raised them on the pivot. Jason jumped a half a dozen or more mule deer out of the ground. And after you hay it or graze it, whichever, and we're doing both, the sage grouse that moves into there, just amazing. So we've created, and when we were doing this and getting NRCS help and the credit system people, they were a little leery to have us put pivots on the place to go along with that. And because they were afraid of the raven perching and the depredation to sage grouse. But that's one of the things we're going to try to show is that the pivots this is taken non-wildlife habitat and created great wildlife habitat with the pivots. We'd have never been able to create that without the pivots. So anyway, I've talked a lot now.
Oh, that's good. I appreciate it. I mean, yeah, it adds a lot more depth to this conversation, and you can see, I mean, this photo on the right, this hole I dug, this plant I dug up, triticale plant. You can see it start to darken up. The roots are going deeper. It's mixing, it's mixing that top organic layer with the subsoil and creating, sort of a darker carbon color throughout the profile. And I believe with the tests you sent me today, I believe, if I'm looking at the right one, that the organic matter level is increasing, which is not surprising at all. Yeah. And maybe upwards of 1% from what it was.
I think about that,
yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, you can see here that this is me digging that hole this summer when I was out in July, and it just, it's incredible, the stark difference. And it's cool to see because of the pivot corners, there are areas that are left essentially untouched, and they're a control to compare from what it was to what it is now. And so, it's that comparison is still there. If you want to look up on YouTube, fungal farming case study with the soil food web, Nicole does her own presentation where she looks at this case study a little bit further, and a lot of it's what we've covered today, but she puts her own spin on it, of course. So what can we learn from cottonwood? Get curious about what's the root cause. And in this case, it was a couple things. Definitely the getting a handle on the water and the water cycle. These major limiting factors, big one being calcium and the lack of fungal development. And how do we work to start to address those major problems? And that compaction issue. One thing I didn't touch on earlier is that compaction creates bacterially dominated soils, and vice versa. Bacteria excesses and imbalances of bacteria create compaction. So it's this sort of vicious cycle. And you've got bacterial dominance, you've got no structure, it can't bring in water, and the bacteria are signaling for these sort of low quality annual weeds, or the less desirable, less palatable species. It's signaling for those to germinate. And so by sort of going about that reset, they were able to break that cycle and get some palatable green growing plants that are actually pumping carbon down into the system. Another piece that we can learn is to not get dogmatic about different tools and practices like tillage and ripping and nitrogen fertilizer. In regenerative ag, we can sort of get dogmatic about that. Like, hey, we can never use these things, but everything is a tool. And if applied in the right situation, at the right time, these can all be a part of a good program. And so, it's not like AG and his family are looking to continue to till and fertilize till the end of time. They're using it responsibly. And another piece is never stop learning. If AG would have given up on this 20 years ago, they never would have got back to, or got to where they are now, finding a solution for it. And then maybe my biggest takeaway hanging out with AG is to get rid of the shoes, start walking around in bare feet on the land and feel what's going on. I think it gives you some good insights into what's actually happening on the land.
Well, you probably just took your whole presentation and now it's going, well, they're just a kook out there doing something, wandering around.
And they would be right.
But also, you mention me all the time. This is such a project of family and employees, and there's so many people involved in all of this besides me. I just end up being the one that people talk to a lot because the others don't really want to do this. So, but anyway, especially this pivot and this soils and all of that, my daughter Mackenzie and son-in-law Jason, this is their baby. At my age, I'd have never put pivots in and things, but so this is they're going to take this ground and run with it.
So in summary, just a reminder, we have our Grazing for Life course, Grazing for Microbiology on integritysoils.com. You can enter the 20% discount code, AgSteward20. And if anybody wants to get a hold of me, talk to me anymore about anything related to what you've seen today, my email's right here, cody@sweetgrassbison.ca, 403-632-7159. Send me a text, give me a call, whatever. I'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, I think, William, you want to open it up to some discussion?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Cody. This was fantastic. And thank you, AG. It's good to see you again, AG.
Good seeing you, William. And I haven't answered your email that you wrote months ago, but yes, we definitely will spread the word for these.
Nice. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, so let's open this up for questions for Cody, or if you have questions directly for AG. We did have a couple of questions in the chat. So one question was, how do you know when to rip the soil, when that's appropriate?
I can't answer that.
In our case, there was nothing. I mean, we tried other things. We certainly didn't want to get into a traditional situation where we're plowing and getting on the fertilizer treadmill and that, but we couldn't. It was impenetrable. I mean, we couldn't do anything else with it. So we had to get us started. We had to rip it, and that's all. We ripped it that once, and we have no intention of turning the soil, doing anything other than seeding into it now. But that's it. We don't intend to rip it again, or in fact, we don't need to. It's amazing how. I think you saw it last year when you were here, Cody. It's no longer that thatch. It's crumbly, and I mean, it's not where we want it yet, but it's so much better than it was. So,
yeah, I was up there a year ago and out there with AG and Nicole, and so I've seen all this, and it was fascinating to see how it has come along. And I think you had on the edge of the field there was a piece of that. Like you called them bricks when they dried up. There was still a piece out there on the edge that we were showing us, and it was fascinating where you didn't have the biology in that piece. That's going to be a brick forever. In 1,000 years, that'll still be there, So it's interesting.
It's still there.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think from my perspective, it seems like ripping is something you would do in an extreme case. And in this case, it turned out well. It was the right decision. So, but I mean, I totally agree, Cody. That's a hard question to answer because of context. There are so many variables, to consider to know when it would be appropriate to do like a ripping event.
I mean, I brought this is my penetrometer. So if anybody, is familiar with the penetrometer, it tests compaction. And so you press this into the soil and measure in PSI how much resistance that you've got as you're pushing the probe in. And, between this and a shovel, and if you, it gives you a good idea where you're at. I don't want to say, if you hit, if you can't even get 1 inch at 300 PSI, then go ahead and rip or anything like that. But I mean, the more compacted and degraded it is, it may be an option in your toolkit. But yeah, there's too many variables related to context. Yeah. Sean, you've got questions there. You wanna open that up a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first, a quick question for AG. Does he like the Garrison Meadow Foxtail? Because it's moving into our place pretty heavy. It's the grass that was growing on his north side.
It is. We have a lot. We actually have a lot of it now. I had a cousin that was trying to raise Garrison seed, and it didn't really take, but he had all this seed. So we put, because we didn't really, some of these ranches out here have Timothy and a little taller grass, and we didn't have any of that. So we put this Garrison in, and it really took off, especially with places where it has water. And so it was it was better than what we had. It's not as good as some of the other grasses and things that we're getting in. And so we're really trying to get on that north side. We need a lot more legumes and clovers in that ground. Interesting, there's a native clover that's really responding to the grazing, and Garrison's a really tough plant for grazing. You can go in there and graze it and it'll come back up, and you can graze it and it'll come back up. But with this grazing, it's given those clovers a chance to get going in that Garrison. And so it's creating a better pasture. Garrison has a fairly good root system for holding capacity in that. Sherm Swanson was on the Cricks, and he was wondering whether it was a good plant to have in these riparian zones, and we did some digging things up and stuff, and he felt like it was a pretty good plant for holding the creek banks and things. So it sure is aggressive. Steve Boyd's my cousin. He had lots and lots of good Timothy ground, and he's downstream from my cousin that was raising Garrison, and now that Garrison's taking over his place. And so Garrison, you don't want to mention Garrison grass to Steve.
In our place, it's taken over the areas that were wiregrass and sedges, the really wet low sloughs, and that's taken over there. So that's been good, but it's also crowded out a lot of Timothy and other stuff too. So I'm afraid we're going to end up with a monoculture of Garrison eventually, but
and you can have that without a doubt. You can have that. The only thing that I've seen that you could, well, when we ripped this and reseeded it, and we've got all those other plants growing, Garrison is still in there, but it's not the majority. It's not taking over. It's just a piece of it. But where it really is aggressive and taking over, the only thing you can just graze the hell out of it.
Yeah,
graze the hell out of it. Knock
it does grow early,
and then that gives those other plants a chance to compete with it.
Yeah,
you don't do something like that.
It's interesting the pivots have worked so good for you, because I've seen other places where, and this would be more like my place where you've got low-lying flood irrigated meadows, where you put the pivots on them, and then you're not putting enough water on to saturate the soil profile. And so you end up with a lot of shallow rooted grasses, and they're you're not saturating the profile. But like with our place, we irrigate it and it saturates that whole soil profile. And it's like a big, a riparian area that's half a mile wide, and a mile and a half long. I've had the NRCS try to talk me into putting in pivots, because we could actually gravity flow the pivots, but I think it would be detrimental to our water cycle and our system.
I've got a couple of comments with that, because that was an issue that we were worried about. One, we didn't have that for our flood control. We didn't have the kind of control for that water to be able to take it on and put it off, and take it on and put it off. Yeah. So that was one of the big issues. The other one, so then about the pivot, what we do with that pivot is we've got the really long, the nozzles are only a couple feet off the ground, and we saturate we run that pivot to the ground to saturate it, then we turn it off. So we saturate the ground, turn it off, and then it create those plants. Our hope anyway is that those plants will, as it dries out, those roots will reach down to the more saturated ground. So I think you can do pivots and get the deep roots, but you got to change how you run the pivot.
Yeah, you see a lot. Most of these farmers, they run it like every day. It goes over, or every other day, the whole thing.
Yeah, and then
Hey, Sean,
then all you do is have short rooted plants. Yeah.
Sean, where's your place?
Jordan Valley, Oregon, southeast corner of Oregon. We're about maybe 4 or 5 hours north and west of AG.
Yeah, very similar country.
Yeah, I actually was at AG's place the first time Nicole was there. I think it was.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There was a stockmanship clinic, and Nicole was there, and so it'd be cool to see it again now that you've done so much changes.
It's changed. It has really changed. It's amazing. It is amazing. So.
Okay, do we have any more questions for Cody? Don't be shy. We've got him on here. Let's take advantage of that. I actually have a question for Cody. You were talking quite a bit about bison. Have you seen a difference in grazing bison and cattle as far as regenerating the land and building up the microbes in the land? Is one species better than the other?
Yeah, I love this topic. Yeah, there's a narrative out there sort of in the public consciousness that, you turn bison out on the land and then within a matter of minutes, it becomes this utopia paradise. Yeah, that's not really true. It's just like any other species of animal. They need to be managed in order to have these positive outcomes we're looking for. And so, I mean, there's a few interesting case studies out there, sort of famous. Like the big one was Ted Turner's Flying D Ranch, Bozeman, Montana, and back in '89 when he bought it, he had the idea. I think it might have been the first ranch that he bought, or one of them. And 113,000 acres, he was going to rip out all the interior fencing and let them, do their thing and just free roam as everybody wants to, envision, which is a beautiful vision. There's a lot of cool things about, thinking back to the herds of bison that pass through the land, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe in one herd. But when they don't have a chance to actually leave for years on end, it becomes problematic. And so what they found there at the Flying D was, bison are one thing they do graze differently. They will go to drink. So if they go to drink at a riparian area, they will not linger. They won't loaf. They'll drink, and they still are thinking, hey, there's going to be a pack of wolves or some bears ready to pounce on me. So they drink and they leave, and they travel further from water, much further from water, up steeper slopes than cattle do. But if they're fenced into a range and they have the opportunity to come back to that same spot where they've clipped it off and you've got nice succulent green growth coming up, they're going to do that, and they get their favorite spots and they come back, and essentially that's of course the definition of overgrazing, coming back and grazing a plant before it's recovered. So that's sort of a myth out there that I think needs to be busted, and I still see it all the time. So then, that basically, where does that leave us as far as regenerative bison management? Well, we still need to manage for plant recovery. So we need to run a paddock system, basically, is where we're at with that, similar to managing any other livestock, except, one thing I forgot to mention Cottonwood's doing is using the GPS collars that have been working really well. Maybe that can be an option with bison in the future, but as it stands, they still need to be managed with electric fences. Definitely our best bet. So that being said, they're still wild. They have, these genetics that are, still largely intact, and their flight zone is much, much bigger than cattle. So, putting them into tiny little paddocks and moving them, you know, you fence a herd, a couple hundred buffalo into an acre or two. It can be done, and I have done it. But you really have to work up to it. You have to, work up with that herd and know that herd intimately and have them comfortable and have that trust built. And you can achieve some pretty cool things as far as grazing, but you're not going to achieve the stock densities generally that you can with cattle, like these million pounds per acre type situations. What we've found with bison is what does work really well. How we can kind of simulate that a bit better is, say we move into a fairly small paddock, and I mean, for example, let's say we're moving 100 head into a 5 acre paddock with water. And then if you strip graze and expose a new strip, a small little strip every so often, if you're doing multiple times a day or daily, and they flock to that new strip and get that animal impact. So the sort of what I'm going to call the effective stock density and the herd effect and animal impact of that is much higher. But then they're not feeling as pressured because every single time you expose a new strip, their paddock's actually getting bigger. And then they're just going back to water that way. So, there's definitely challenges as far as I think, if your goal was to say build soil health and build soil carbon as rapidly as possible, I think you're probably better off to do that with cattle. But that's not always the goal. So bison have their place on the landscape for sure.
All right, thank you. I find that insightful. That's pretty great. As far as marketing the bison, how has that been going?
Well, the bison market, I mean, if anybody's familiar with it, it was not really an industry up until the 80s and 90s, and started to gain some traction in the 90s, and there was this huge run up of breeding stock prices in the 90s. It was a bit of a bubble, and so early 2000s that bubble burst and that totally collapsed, and then we also had the BSE outbreak, which impacted the bison industry. And so after 2003, bison were worth nearly nothing. People were just giving them away. And after 2003, I'd say that the awareness, the consumer awareness around bison as a an actual legitimate meat source kept growing, and the demand has continued to increase. Like prior to that, in the 90s, it used to be lumped in with things like ostrich and weird animal alligator and as an exotic. And technically, I think within the USDA, it's still classified as an exotic, even though it's the most native animal. But anyways, and so since then, in the last, I would say, decade since I've been involved, the consumer awareness and the demand has continued to increase. We had a bit of a crash near COVID due to a few different factors, and it hasn't recovered like the sort of I guess you could call it the commodity market. The bison industry is tiny compared to the cattle industry, but the commodity market, if you're just to sell your calves out on the open market or whatever, that hasn't really recovered yet. So prices are still depressed on that front. I would say it's a great time to get into bison. I don't think the demand is going to go away for the meat. And I think the first generation of ranchers are starting to exit. So I think it's a good opportunity to get in. A lot of people are direct marketing and building their own markets, which is what we've done. And I mean, it's good. Like you can charge generally higher prices than beef, but the challenges with direct marketing are the same as any other enterprise. I mean, if you're trying to be a primary producer plus a marketer, all those things, it's really difficult no matter which way you shake it.
All right, that sounds good. You talked about your class with the grazing for microbiology. So you want to share a little bit more about that with us? It sounds very intriguing to me and like something that we need.
Yeah, so Nicole and I started talking about this about a little over a year ago about needing this, this sort of intensive and how do we manage livestock in a variety of contexts and different systems across the world because our audience is global for microbiology. It's not really out there. There's not, there are some online grazing courses, and of course there's holistic management training and stuff like that. But what we developed is this grazing for biology through the lens of the 5 M's, which I talked about in this presentation. So mindset, management, minerals, microbes, and organic matter. And so really that's our approach. We've dove into this topic through that 5 M's and really starting with getting the context piece right, because what works in one region is not necessarily going to be applicable in another. For example, like just being at Cottonwood these last few years, what works in Northeast Nevada, it's probably not going to be the same as a New Zealand dairy system. And so, we're really looking for these overarching principles of, seeing when we look at our soil, we start to look at what's going on with the biology and actually start testing it and figuring out what is our, say, fungal to bacteria ratio. What does our environment want to be naturally? A grassland is going to generally tend to be more bacterially dominated, and more forested systems are naturally more fungal dominated. So where do we fall in that spectrum or that continuum, and what do we want our landscape to become? And that really influences how we graze and how we approach our grazing. In a lot of cases, like we see across the western half of North America and more arid environments, that we are just so bacterially dominant, and it's a sort of an epidemic. And so really getting into, okay, how do we identify and confirm that, and then what sort of management do we take, what sort of management approaches do we take to shift that ratio back to higher fungal? So that's a bit of insight into that. Yeah, I would say check it out if you're looking to gain a deeper understanding about how these systems work, and really start to wrap our heads around biology. I'd say it's a great course. We're at just the tip of the iceberg, and William, of course, this as somebody in the biological world. We know just a tiny fraction of the way that these biological systems work. And so it's ever evolving. We're all learning together as we're doing right now. So everybody who can, learn themselves, apply it on the land, try some things out, share it as a sort of collective collaborative, we're going to be able to move forward this movement and understanding of how to graze for biology.
Yeah, thank you, Cody. That's really great. It sounds like a class that everybody needs to take. It sounds really good. I'm buried in the microscope a lot, and I was doing a class recently with a bunch of people. My microscope is fun because I have a camera on it and I can cast it up onto a big screen. So as I'm looking in the microscope, I can show the class what we're seeing. And we were just looking, and we saw something, and I don't know what it was, but it was moving, so it was alive. And it looked kind of like a protozoa, but it's nothing I've ever seen before. And everything else in that sample were really good organisms. It was a highly oxygenated soil sample. And so all the good guys were there, and yet there's this thing. And of course, the class wanted to know what it was. And of course, I said, I have no idea. And so what you're saying, Cody, about, it's so true, because there's so much that we don't know. There's so much more that we don't know than we do know. And so what you're saying is absolutely true. We need to be learning and sharing what we're learning and what we're seeing with the entire community. We need Dr. Elaine Ingham, she always says, we need more people getting master's degrees and PhDs in this so that we can start naming all of these creatures. Because, there's like hundreds of thousands of creatures that we know exist, and they don't even have a name yet. So the field is wide open for this, so yeah. Nobody needs to be bored because there's plenty of work to do in this life.
Hey, William, I have a question for you then. Are you looking much into the biology of these rangelands around you in Nevada?
Yeah, actually I am mostly just here on Jared's ranch. So I live here on Jared's ranch, and I work for him, but I also run my own business. And so, yeah, I mean, we're looking at the forest land up where the quaking aspens are growing, and all the way down in the lowlands where there's sagebrush, the irrigated pastures. So I'm looking at that a lot, and we're making a lot of compost and putting inoculant out on different pieces of land every year. Of course, we're doing the rotational grazing to try to spread the goodness out there. It was fun this last fall because we had 2,000 head come in, and we were able to move them across a section of land that really needed the animal impact. So that's going to be fun to watch that over the course of the next couple of years and see what kind of impact we got from that. We certainly tried to do it correctly so that we were moving them about every 2 days and trying to spread that manure out. But
What are you seeing when you look at through the microscope in some of these rangeland soils?
yeah, I mean, most of it's bacterial dominant. It's, not a lot of diversity, mostly just the cocci. Sometimes we'll see some bacillus. Where there's a place in Utah, and a friend just brought me the soil sample, but it was a cornfield that's been being farmed conventionally. And usually what you're seeing are lots of bacterial dominants. It was totally dead. There was nothing in it. I don't even know how it was growing corn. I mean, obviously they're using all the synthetic fertilizers, but there was nothing in it. It was completely dead. It looked like it had been contaminated with some kind of heavy metal. Yet the plants were still growing. So that was scary, but interesting and enlightening. But most of the rangelands are just bacterial dominant, very little fungus. Here on Jared's land, when you get to the higher elevations, we are seeing some fungus around. If you get under the trees, then we're seeing a diversity of fungus, different colors, different sizes, different widths of the fungus. So, that's a good sign for sure. And we've been seeing mushrooms out in the irrigated land more. As time goes on, we see more and more. Last year, there was a big mushroom out there that was about 16 inches across. And that was a new thing. Jared had never seen that in all the years he's been here. So good things are happening. It's discouraging sometimes because we're on webinars like this quite often. I mean, when I say we, I mean our community, those of us who are on this type of thing, the regen ag people. And we see the side-by-side pictures of Alan Savory and, all the different people. And we think that that's going to happen overnight. And it doesn't usually happen. It takes time. We've got to realize and look at those dates of those pictures. Sometimes this is taking decades. So we need to realize from year to year when we're out there all the time that it does take time. And so it was very encouraging to me to see those giant mushrooms. And it wasn't just one. They were there was a section of the field where they were all over the place. So it was fun. So good things are happening. All right. I want to remind you from Ag Steward that we have a class coming up in a week or so. It's on February 15th and 16th. And I've got the link here for that. I put it in earlier, but I just barely put it in the notes. So go to this link, the events page of agsteward.co. And this is a class that Jared's putting on. The purpose of this class is to help us bump our businesses up to the next level financially. Of course, this is the Profitable Ag Steward. We are all about profitability. We want to be able to be making the right decisions and a big part of that is to be profitable. If we are not profitable, we are not going to be in business for very long. So Jared is fantastic at helping people one-on-one to be able to move our business from one step to the next. And this is a fantastic opportunity. I've seen him work with a lot of people, and in some ways it's been a miracle. The way that he's able to interact with people and help them to see maybe where the roadblocks are, and to help them have the confidence to make the steps in the right direction. So get this link off the comments here. Go to this page and get signed up for this. It's a low dollar deal. I hate to say the price because I forgot, but I think it's under $50. And this is going to be fantastic. I know a lot of people out there who are trying to get to the point where, you know, they can make $100,000, like with, like, you know, they actually made that much money. And there's a lot of people kind of stuck and they can't quite get to that point. And so the goal for this is to help people get to the next level wherever you need to be, whatever your goal is. And so I actually signed up for it. I know I work with Jared, but I didn't care. I paid the money and I signed up. So I'm going to be in that class and it's going to be fun. So personally for me, I'm excited about it because I have a small business and that's kind of where I am. I'm on that place where I'm making some money, but I really want to push it to that $100,000 bit of profitability, which would be good for a lot of us. And I know a lot of the bigger ranchers, you know, sometimes we think we made some money and then we get 3 more bills at the end of the year, and that can be frustrating. So I know this is going to be a great event. So are there any more questions for Cody before we wrap this up this evening? This is your last chance. Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me okay? This is Jared.
Yeah, we can hear you, Jared.
Thanks for running this today, William. Thank you, Cody. I appreciate it. I was on for part of it and then lost service. I am driving back from St. George, Utah. Had the blessing and opportunity to go and speak at the Soil Health in the West conference and meet and rub shoulders with Alejandro Carrillo, and Joel Salatin was a keynote speaker. So it's amazing the movement that regeneration is, the traction it's gaining, the movement that's behind this. What started as just small ripple, I think, is now becoming not a tidal wave, but it's definitely something that can be felt in the market. Consumers are looking for regenerative labels. And I think that as producers, we are behind the curve a little bit. Like, I think very soon, and probably in some places, the demand is outpacing the supply for truly regenerative sourced food and fiber as well. So we encourage you to stay plugged in with what we do. And probably I'll just share my biggest takeaway from Alejandro was that if it can be done, what he has done in a less than 9-inch rainfall, very, very harsh environment, if it can be done in the Chihuahuan Desert, if you can restore desert to grasslands, I think the rest of us have got it relatively easy. We talk about a super harsh environment. And so we always see and hear and think, well, it might work there, but it won't work here. And it was very fortuitous that he was able to come to southern Utah, a very harsh environment, and explain to those people that, yes, if you follow the basic principles, and one of his key principles is long recovery periods, like more than a year, sometimes 18-month long recovery periods, and move as often as you can in the high intensity grazing, but make sure those long recovery periods are worked into that. So thanks everybody for, appreciate William for facilitating this, and thank you, Cody, for jumping on. And what I caught was so back
All right, perfect. Jared got a little spotty there at the end, so I don't know if we lost him but we're grateful that he was able to jump on while he's traveling. Thank you so much, Cody. We appreciate you. Your presentation was fantastic, and that's going to be a great thing for all of us to go back through and look at our notes and to watch the recording later on. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. And thank you all for being here. Remember to go to the Ag Steward link that we have here for more information. And we will see you guys next time.